At 52, Diane Kessler had $81, a tan suitcase, and a marriage certificate that wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. What she had left after 30 years was a building nobody else on Earth wanted, a dead telephone exchange on Campbell Avenue Southwest, down in the worn-out end of downtown Roanoke, a block off the rail yards. 2 stories of brick, gone the color of old scab, the neon sign long burned dark, the kind of place the whole city had trained itself to drive past without seeing. Her husband signed it over to her for $1 single and called himself generous. He thought he was handing her a tomb. He never noticed the steel panel behind the 4th switchboard, screwed shut and painted over so many times the screw heads had vanished under the gray. He never knew her father had spent 40 years wiring something into those walls, patient and silent as a held breath, and that every last bit of it had been meant for her. Curtis Lang took the house. He took the car, the savings, and the better half of her name. He took all the easy things, the way men like Curtis always take the easy things first and call it winning. The one thing he was too clever to want would turn out to be the only thing that ever told Diane the truth about who had loved her, and for how long, and at what cost. She just didn't know it yet. On the morning it all came apart, all she knew was that the building was cold. The city bus smelled of wet rubber and someone's gas station coffee. Diane sat 3 rows from the back with the suitcase wedged between her knees, watching Roanoke slide by through a streaked window. Jefferson Street, the shuttered market stalls, the Blue Ridge sitting blue and patient on the far edge of everything, the way those mountains do, not caring one way or the other what happens to the small people down in the valley. $81. She had counted it twice in the bus shelter. Twice because the first count had felt like a typo her life would surely come back and fix. It did not. 1 soft 20, 2 10s worn to felt, the rest in singles gone the gray of a church bulletin, and a little fold of quarters she'd been hoarding for a laundromat she no longer had any reason to visit. That was the arithmetic of it. 30 years of marriage came out to $81, and a suitcase she'd packed in the dark so the neighbors on Grandin Road wouldn't stand at their windows and watch. Curtis had been a property man. That was the word he liked, property man, said the way other men say doctor. He bought tired houses, painted over their problems, and sold them to people who wouldn't find the problems until he was 3 deals gone. For most of those 30 years, Diane had believed the houses were the only things he flipped. Near the end, she understood he had been flipping her too, painting over the trouble, waiting for the right buyer for his own life. He had told her at the kitchen table, over the good placemats, the way you'd mention rain. There was someone. There was a plan. There was, it turned out, a lawyer already on retainer, which meant the someone and the plan were older than the conversation by a good long while. 2 days before the bus, she had sat in a paneled room in the Roanoke City Courthouse and listened to a lawyer named Pruitt read her whole life out loud and put a price on every line of it. He had a yellow legal pad and a voice with no weather in it at all. He read the house, appraised, the Ford, appraised. The retirement account Curtis had been quietly bleeding for 2 years, what was left of it, appraised. Every item had a number, and every number slid over into Curtis's column like a coin going down a slot. Neat, final, gone. Then Pruitt reached the last line, and his pen stopped. The Campbell Avenue property, he said. The former telephone exchange, carried as a marital asset, a small, dry cough. Condition, poor. Tax value, $14,000. Structure only. Realistically, no value. A liability, frankly, with the back assessments owing. No value. The 2 words landed on the table and just sat there in front of everybody. Diane heard her own voice then, smaller than she'd wanted it to be. I'll take it. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet right before people decide to enjoy themselves. Curtis leaned back in his chair, the good gray suit, the watch she had given him for their 20th anniversary catching the overhead light, and let one corner of his mouth tip up. "Let her have the phone building, Your Honor," he said. Diane always did prefer talking to people who can't talk back, and the gallery laughed. Not all of them, but enough. A low, easy ripple of it. The sound a crowd makes at a woman who fought a 30-year marriage all the way down to a dead utility building and called it a victory. Curtis's partner laughed loudest from the second row, a developer with very good teeth and a very soft handshake, a man whose name Diane would learn to hate before the summer was out. She kept her chin level and her hands folded in her lap and did not give them the one thing they wanted, which was her face. Inside, though, she felt something she had no clean word for. Erased was close. Like a name scrubbed off a mailbox, like the house remembered but the person no longer living there. The judge, a tired woman named Halloran, who had plainly sat through worse Tuesdays than this one, did not laugh. She moved the exchange into Diane's column with 2 strokes of a pen and made Curtis sign the transfer for the legal price of consideration, $1 so the record would hold up clean. Curtis signed it the way a man signs for a parcel he never ordered. Then he slid an actual dollar bill across the table, folded once down the middle, a tip for the help. "There," he said. "Now you've got someplace to keep all that sentiment." She took the dollar. She would hold on to that dollar a long time, though not for any reason he would have understood. So at 5:45 that evening, with the daylight going amber and the rail yards starting up their iron clatter somewhere behind the buildings, Diane Kessler stood on the cracked front walk of the only address left in the world that belonged to her. Campbell Avenue Southwest looked like a street the century had dropped on its way out the door. Half the storefronts were papered over from the inside. A pawn shop 2 doors down kept its sign lit out of pure habit. And there, in the middle of the block, squat and stubborn and refusing to fall down, sat her father's exchange. Dark red brick. The words, Kessler Exchange, still ghosting in dead white paint over the door. A chain run through both handles, thick enough to moor a barge. She carried the suitcase up the walk since the little wheels were useless on broken concrete, listing hard to one side, her faded denim jacket too thin against the river-damp cold rising up off the Roanoke River 2 blocks south. The padlock was the size of her fist and gone orange with rust. But Pruitt's office had handed her an envelope along with the deed, and inside the envelope was a ring of keys. And on the ring, among all the dead and ordinary ones, was a small brass tag worn smooth by some thumb across some long stretch of years. It was stamped with 2 letters and nothing else. D.K. Diane turned it over in the cold. There was no door in that building those initials matched, not that anyone had ever mentioned to her, and they weren't her father's. Walter Kessler had been W.K. His whole life, on every check he wrote and every Christmas card he signed in his slow, careful hand. D.K. was a stranger riding the key ring of a dead man. For just a second, standing there with her breath fogging the dark, she felt the small, odd current of a thing that had been waiting on her a long time without her ever knowing it was there. Then she found the key that fit the padlock, and the chain slithered down off the handles with a sound like the building letting out a breath it had been holding for years. Inside, the air was colder than the street and older than anything she had touched in a decade. It smelled of dust and of machine oil gone thick as varnish, and under all of it, faint as a name you can almost place, the smell of her own childhood, floor wax, pipe tobacco, her father. She found a light switch by feel, and to her surprise, it still worked. A single bank of bulbs stuttered, caught, and buzzed on overhead, and there it was. The reason one building could hold one man for 40 years. The switchboards ran the length of the back wall in a long row, 6 of them, each one tall as a wardrobe, their faces studded with hundreds of dark jacks and cold lamps, the cloth-wrapped cords hanging down in patient loops. Above every station was a number, 1 through 6, hand-lettered and just slightly crooked, the exact careful crookedness her father had brought to everything he ever wrote. Women had sat here once, all night, plugging the town into itself, Verna and the others. Voices in the dark saying, "Go ahead," saying, "One moment, please." Diane walked the row slowly, dragging one finger through the gray fur of dust on the wood. At position 4, she stopped. 2 things were wrong with position 4, or right, depending on how the next month went. The first was the wall behind it. Where every other station backed against bare brick, this one backed against a flat steel panel, gray and industrial, bolted into the masonry and painted the same exhausted color as the rest of the room, so that a person would walk right past it unless a person was looking hard. Whoever had sealed it had not meant for it to be opened again. The second thing was the writing. Cut into the metal frame above the station, small and deliberate, in the very same crooked hand as the stenciled numbers, were 7 words, not painted, scratched, carved with something sharp by someone who had wanted them to outlast every coat of paint that came after. Keep the line open for the ones who can't pay. Diane read it 3 times. She did not know what it meant. She did not know that the answer was already in the room with her, sealed behind a steel panel, not a foot from her hand, waiting the same way her father had always waited, the same way the little brass tag in her pocket had been waiting all these years for the one hand it was cut for. She only knew all at once and without one good reason that she was never going to sell this building to Curtis Lang or to his soft-handed friend or to anyone alive. Outside, a car slowed on Campbell Avenue and idled. And then, from the chain-link fence along the dark side lot, a small shape that had been standing very still for a very long time finally spoke. "You've got his hands," the old woman said, out of the shadow. "I'd know Walter Kessler's hands anywhere on this earth." The old woman stepped out of the dark by the chain-link fence and into the throw of the streetlight, and she came slow, the way the old come slow, one hand riding the links for balance, the other holding the collar of a coat that had been good wool once, a long time ago, in some better decade. She was small and built close to the ground, with a face folded soft as a paper sack that had been opened and closed 1,000 times, and eyes that did not waver off Diane's hands even to find the rest of her. "Walter's hands," she said again, quieter, like a thing she was telling herself. He had those same long fingers, could plug 100 lines an hour and never once cross a wire. "I sat next to those hands for 30 years, honey. You don't forget hands you watch that long." Diane stood very still in the open doorway with the light buzzing behind her. "You knew my father, knew him." The old woman made a sound that was half a laugh and the other half something with no name. "I'm about the last one left who did. Verna Sokol. I ran the night board here from 1961 until the company killed the place. Your daddy and me closed this building down together, the 2 of us. Last ones out the night, they cut the power for good." She came up the cracked walk and stopped at the bottom of the step, looking up. And here's his girl, with his hands, standing in his door like she fell out of the sky. "Diane," she said. "I'm Diane. I know who you are." Verna's eyes went bright and wet in the streetlight, though her voice held level. "He had your school picture taped inside position 4, right under the lamp shelf where the supervisor couldn't see it. 40 years that picture hung there. Little girl with a gap in her teeth and a Sunday dress. She wiped at nothing with the back of her wrist. Lord, look at you now." Something turned over hard in Diane's chest. She had not cried at the courthouse. She had not cried on the bus or in the bus shelter counting her $81 twice. But she felt the whole long day rise up the back of her throat now, here, on a broken step on Campbell Avenue, in front of a stranger who had loved her father. "Would you come in?" Diane said. "Please. I don't really know what I'm looking at in here." And Verna Sokol smiled for the first time, a slow folding open of that paper sack face, and she said, Honey, I know exactly what you're looking at. I helped him build half of it. Inside, under the single buzzing bank of bulbs, the old woman moved like a person walking back into her own girlhood. She set her hand on the first switchboard the way you'd set your hand on the flank of an old horse you'd thought was dead. And she went down the row, naming them. And the names were not numbers. They were the women who had sat there. This was Loretta's board. She had a voice like warm syrup, could talk a drunk man home from a phone booth and have him thanking her for it. This one was Pearl's. This middle one nobody wanted because the chair had a wobble Walter never could fix, and he could fix anything. She stopped at the third and her hand drifted. This one was mine. 30 years, right here. You sat in the dark with one little lamp and you held the whole town in your two hands, and nobody out there in their beds ever once thought about you. That was the job, to be the voice in the dark that nobody thinks about. She came to position 4 and her hand stopped above the wood, not touching it. And this, Verna said softly, this was Walter's, the serving position, where the night man sat. She looked at the flat gray steel panel bolted into the brick behind it. Now that wasn't here in my day. He put that in after. After they shut us down and everybody else went home and forgot about the place, your daddy kept his key and he kept coming back. Years he came back. I'd see his truck. I never asked him what he was doing in a dead building 3 nights a week with the lights low. She finally let her fingers rest on the cold metal. He told me one time. Only once. He said, Verna, I'm leaving the line open for the ones who can't pay. Diane felt the back of her neck go cold. That's what it says. She pointed up at the 7 words scratched into the frame above the station. Small and patient and deliberate. There. He carved it. Verna leaned in and read it with her lips moving. The way people of a certain generation read a thing that matters. Keep the line open for the ones who can't pay. She straightened slow. He meant it more ways than one, she said. I'd put money on it. Your daddy never said a thing he only meant the one way. She looked at Diane a long moment. What's that in your hand? You've been holding it this whole time. Diane looked down. She had not even known she was still gripping the keyring. She held up the little brass tag worn smooth, the 2 letters stamped into it. DK. This was on the ring with the deed, she said, but it isn't his. He was WK always, Walter Kessler. There's no door in here these fit, and I can't make sense of who DK is. The old woman did not answer right away. She took the tag between 2 fingers and turned it to the light and looked at it for what felt to Diane like a very long time. And something moved across her folded face, some understanding arriving from very far off, and her eyes came up slow and found Diane's. Honey, Verna said gently, what's your name? Your whole name. The one on your birth certificate before you ever married that man. Diane. Her voice came out strange. Diane Kessler. I took my maiden name back. 2 days ago in the divorce. Diane Kessler. Diane Kessler, Verna repeated, and her thumb pressed the 2 worn letters as if to be sure of them. DK. The bulbs buzzed overhead. Somewhere out in the dark, the rail yard let off a long, groaning couple of its cars, iron finding iron, and the floor of the old exchange hummed with it, faint and far away. I don't think this opens a door, child, Verna said. I think your daddy was telling you whose it all was. The whole time. He just couldn't say it out loud where the wrong people could hear. Diane did not sleep that night. She made a bed of her folded denim jacket on the old supervisor's cot in the back room, and she lay in the dark with the brass tag warm in her fist, and she listened to the building tick and settle around her, like a thing breathing. And she thought about a man who had taped his daughter's school picture under a lamp shelf for 40 years and never once told her it was there. In the morning, she went to find out what was behind the panel, and in the morning, on the cracked front walk, she found Curtis instead. He was not alone. He stood on her broken concrete in a different good suit, a gray one with his developer partner beside him, the man with the very good teeth from the second row of the courtroom, and a third man in a windbreaker holding a clipboard, who had the unmistakable soft officialdom of someone paid to measure things. A black sedan idled at the curb behind them. Curtis had a folded paper in his hand, and he was smiling the smile he used on people right before the part they wouldn't like. "Diane," he said warmly, "you look tired." "Curtis, this is Hal Brennan." "You'll remember Hal," the good teeth flashed. "Hal's firm just optioned the whole railside parcel. Norfolk Southern's expanding the yard, did you hear? Whole block's going to be staging ground inside 2 years. Funny how things turn. All this junk." He gestured up at the brick, at the ghost letters, at Kessler Exchange fading over the door. Turns out the dirt under it's worth something after all. Diane said nothing. She had learned in 30 years that her silence cost him more than her words ever had. Here's the thing. Curtis came up one step, lowering his voice into the register he used for reasonableness. "There's a problem with the transfer, a title problem. Turns out a property like this, with back taxes owing, the way it was conveyed at the settlement, my lawyers tell me the whole thing may not hold. Consideration wasn't adequate. $1. He shook his head, sorrowful as a funeral. "A judge could void it. Probably will. So I'm doing you a kindness here. Before the lawyers run the meter, Hal's prepared to buy your interest. Today, clean. $40,000, and you walk away from this whole sad little chapter with something in your pocket for once. $40,000. 2 days ago, it would have sounded like the voice of God." Diane stood on her own doorstep in yesterday's clothes with $81 to her name and felt the pull of it, the awful sane gravity of it, and she thought about Verna's thumb pressed to 2 worn brass letters, and she thought about a school picture in the dark. "No," she said. The good teeth stopped flashing. The man with the clipboard looked up. "Diane." Curtis's voice thinned. "Don't be a child. You can't make the taxes. You can't make a roof. You can't make the lights. You've got no money and no man and no earthly idea what you're sitting on. It's a dead building. I'm handing you a way out. You're handing me a thing you already decided you wanted," Diane said quietly, "which is how I know to keep it." Hal Brennan made a small sound through his very good teeth and looked away down Campbell Avenue as though the conversation had begun to bore him. Curtis's face did the thing it did, the painting over, the smooth coming down hard across the trouble underneath. "All right," he said, "all right. Have it the hard way. You always did." He turned, then turned back, and dropped the folded paper on her step so it lay there on the cracked concrete between her shoes. "That's a petition. Forced sale. To satisfy the liens. You'll get your notice for the hearing. Roanoke City Circuit Court 3 weeks. Bring a lawyer if you can find one who works for $81. He had counted it. Somehow he knew the number. Of course he knew the number. He had spent 30 years knowing exactly how much she had. The sedan pulled them away down the avenue and left her standing there in the morning cold with the paper at her feet, and she did not pick it up right away. She looked up instead at the dead white letters over the door, her father's name, her name, and she felt the 3 weeks settle onto her shoulders like a hand. Then she went back inside, and she went to position 4, and she got down on her knees in front of the gray steel panel and started to look for the way in. It took her the rest of the morning to understand there were no screws to turn, not anymore, that whoever had sealed it had ground the heads flat and painted them into the metal so it read as solid wall. But her father had not built a thing to be solid wall. Her father had left the tag on the ring, and the phrase on the frame, and a school picture under the lamp, and a man like that does not seal a door forever. He seals it against the wrong hands and leaves a seam for the right ones. She found the seam with her fingers a little before noon, running them along the bottom edge of the panel where it met the old baseboard, where the paint had cracked in a line too straight to be an accident. A draft came out of it, cool and dry and smelling of paper and machine oil and 40 years of held breath. And down in the corner, where the steel met the floor, Her fingertips found a small recessed plate, and in the center of the plate, a keyhole, and beside the keyhole, scratched tiny into the metal in the same patient crooked hand as everything else her father had ever left her. 2 letters. DK. Diane sat back on her heels in the dust and the buzzing light, and she took the worn brass tag off the ring, and for the first time since the courthouse, with no one there to see her do it, she let herself begin to cry. For a while, she just knelt there on the gritty floor and let it come, the way you let weather come when there is no roof left and no use in pretending you have one. The dust of 40 years settled soft on her shoulders. The bank of bulbs buzzed its one flat note above her head, and Diane Kessler, 52 years old with $81 to her name and a suitcase in the back room and a petition lying out on the front walk, where a man who had never loved her had dropped it in the cold, cried on her knees for a father she was only now, far too late, beginning to meet. Then she wiped her face with the heel of her hand, the way he used to do at the supper table when he thought no one was watching, and she looked at the ring again. There were 3 keys on it. She had handled that ring 100 times in 2 days and never once truly looked at it, because grief makes a person stupid about small things, and because she had been so certain the little tag was the whole of the mystery that it had never occurred to her to ask what the tag was tied to. But it was tied to a key, a small one, older than the rest, its brass worn to the soft brown of a thing handled across a lifetime, and the smooth tag stamped DK, hung off it by a twist of copper wire, and it had been hanging off it. She understood now with a slow, cold turning in her chest, since before she had been old enough to walk. The tag had never been a riddle. It had been a label. Her father had cut a key and marked it with the name of the girl it belonged to, and then he had done the one thing he had always known how to do better than any man alive. He had waited, the way the whole dark building waited. For the one hand, the key was cut to fit. She carried it down to the corner where the steel panel met the floor, and she fit it into the little recessed plate, and she turned it. It did not want to go. 40 years is a long time for a lock to hold its breath. She worked it the way you work anything old and proud and stubborn, a little back and a little forward, coaxing. And she felt the works inside surrender their rust 1 grain at a time, until at last, with a small dry sound like a cough, the bolt turned over and the bottom edge of the panel sprang loose a 1/4 inch into her fingers. The whole gray face of it swung out then on a hidden hinge, smooth and silent, balanced so fine a child could have moved it, and the cool, dry breath of all those sealed years came sighing out into the room, and it smelled of cedar and machine oil and paper, kept in the dark. It was not a vault, the way she had let herself imagine a vault. It was a cupboard, deep and square and lined in pale cedar, the careful joinery of a man working on his own time for his own reasons, every corner true. And it was not crammed, it was arranged, everything inside it set in its place by hands that had owned all the time in the world and had meant every single minute of it. On the top shelf sat a row of ledgers, plain black cloth-bound books, the kind they used to sell at the 5 and dime, a dozen of them at least, lined up shoulder to shoulder with their spines marked by year in white grease pencil. She drew one out, the newest. She opened it under the buzzing light, and she did not understand at first what she was looking at. Names, page after page of names, in her father's small, upright hand, that crooked, careful printing she would have known anywhere. Beside each name, a number. Beside each number, a date. And down at the foot of every page, a sum. And beside the sum, 2 words. The same 2 words, over and over, month after month, year upon year, written so many hundreds of times that the hand had worn them down to a kind of private shorthand of mercy, carried forward. She turned the pages and the names went back and back. The Hartleys on Tazewell, old Mrs. Pruitt over on Day Avenue, A family called Coyle. 6 children, the number beside them never once in all those years showing a thing paid in. Carried forward, carried forward. She did not yet know what she held. She only knew, the way you know a thing in your body before your mind will say it plain, that she was holding something that had cost a quiet man a great deal across a very long time, and that he had never told a living soul. You have likely already guessed some of what was inside that cedar cupboard. I promise you, you have not guessed all of it, because under the ledgers, on the second shelf, wrapped in a square of oilcloth and tied with the same copper wire as the key, was a bundle, and when she unwound it and folded back the cloth, what lay inside was a stack of papers gone the pale gold of old butter, thick as a brick and just as heavy in the hand, and across the top one, printed in the stern engraving of the United States Treasury, were the words she would carry to the end of her days. A savings bond, a government savings bond, Series E, $25, and there, in the box where the law required a name, where a man was meant to write who the bond was for and who would have it when it came due, was a name in her father's small, crooked, careful hand, Diane Kessler, her own name, her maiden name, the name she had carried as a gap-toothed girl in a Sunday dress, and the name she had only 2 days ago, in a cold courtroom, fought to take back. And here it was, written in the hand of a man 20 years in his grave, on a thing he had bought and put away in the dark and never said one word about. She turned it over with fingers that had begun to shake. Behind it, another, same name. Behind that one, another, and the date stamped on each one was a month later than the last. She fanned them in the buzzing light, and the dates ran backward under her thumb like a calendar coming apart. This year and the year before and the year before that, down and down through the decades, and her breath went out of her all at once when she came to the last one at the very bottom of the stack, the oldest, the first, soft as cloth with age, the ink of her name gone brown. The date on it was the month she was born. He had bought one every month. From the month she came into the world, a young man then with grease under his nails and a daughter brand new in the house, every single month for 52 years, $25 he could not always spare, laid down quiet at the post office window with her name on it, and carried home and put in the dark. And never, not once, not on a single birthday or graduation or wedding day, not in all the long years of her marriage to a man who counted her every dollar, had he told her they existed. She sat down flat on the dusty floor with the bundle in her lap, and she did not cry this time. It had gone past crying. She just sat, holding 52 years of a silent man's love in her 2 hands, in the very building where he had taped her school picture under a lamp shelf so the supervisor would not see it. And she felt the whole shape of him come clear to her at last, the way a photograph comes up slow in the chemical bath. A man who had never once in her hearing said the word love because he had been too busy spending 50 years of it where she could not see. It was full dark outside when she finally moved again, and she knew she could not be alone with it 1 minute longer. She went to the door and out into the cold, and down the cracked walk past the petition still lying where Curtis had let it fall. And she did not stop until she had found the little frame house 4 streets over where Verna Sokol had told her she still lived, and she knocked on the old woman's door with the bundle held against her chest like a child. Verna took one look at her face under the porch light and did not ask a single question. She only said, "You found it," and reached for her coat. They sat together at the exchange until past midnight, the 2 of them, the old operator and the dead man's daughter, with the ledgers spread open across the supervisor's desk and the bonds stacked careful between them, and it was Verna who put the words to it at last. She ran one bent finger down a column of those patient figures, down all those families and all those sums marked carried forward and never marked paid, and her old eyes filled and did not spill. "He never cut them off," she said softly. That's what this is, child. You see these numbers? These are the lines he kept open. After the company shut us down, after they sent the bills to collection and turned the rest of the town over to the machines, there were families in this city. The Coyles, the Pruitts, folks with sick babies and no work and winter coming on, who'd have had no telephone at all, no way to call a doctor in the night, no way to call for help. She tapped the page, and your daddy kept their lines alive, out of his own pocket, quiet. Month after month, year after year, he paid it himself, and he wrote it down right here, and he never sent one of them a bill they couldn't meet. She looked up. Keep the line open for the ones who can't pay. You thought that was just words he scratched in the wall. Her voice broke at last, gentle as a thing setting down. Honey, it was the books. It was 40 years of the books. Diane looked at the 7 worn words scratched above position 4, and then at the columns of names, and she understood that her invisible father had loved a whole city the same way he had loved her, in silence, in the dark, where nobody would ever think to look or thank him for it. And then Verna, going careful through the bundle, came to the last paper of all, the one folded thrice at the very bottom of the oilcloth, stiffer than the others, and she opened it under the lamp and went very still. Diane, she said, Diane, look at this. It was not a bond. It was a deed of gift, drawn up proper with a lawyer's heavy language and a notary's seal pressed deep into the corner, and below the seal a row of signatures and a date, and across the top in the clerk's official stamp the words recorded, City of Roanoke. Walter Kessler had signed away the exchange. The whole building, the land beneath it, the dead neon and the brick and every secret sealed inside it, deeded over free and clear to one sole owner, to Diane Kessler. And the date the city had stamped on it, the date it had been carried down to the courthouse and recorded into the permanent rolls of Roanoke for any living soul to find, was 11 years gone. 11 years. Long before the divorce, long before Curtis Lang had ever stood up in a courtroom and waved this building off as a piece of worthless junk and let her have it for $1, with the gallery laughing at the woman who had fought for a ruin. Verna set the deed down on the desk very slowly, and she looked across the lamplight at Diane, and the old woman's folded face had gone from grief to something else entirely, something that, after a long moment, Diane recognized as the beginning of a hard and righteous joy. Honey, Verna said quietly, he didn't leave it to you in his will. Do you understand what I'm telling you? It never went through any estate. It never went into any pile for any judge to split between you and that man. She pressed her finger to the date, the old stamp, the proof of it. This was yours 11 years ago. It was yours the whole time you were married to him. It was yours the very day he stood up in that courtroom and called it trash and handed it to you for $1, like he was doing you the favor of your life. Her voice dropped to almost nothing, and there was iron threaded all through it now. Curtis didn't give you one thing, child. You cannot give a person what was never yours to hold. The one piece of all of it that he was dead certain was worthless. And it's the one piece that was already free and clear in your name. Outside, far off across the rail yards, the courthouse clock began to strike the hour. 12 slow strokes rolling down Campbell Avenue through the cold, and somewhere in the patient count of them, Diane Kessler stopped being a woman the world had decided it was finished with, and became a woman with 3 weeks, a notarized deed, and her father's book spread open in front of her in the lamplight. She had a hearing to get ready for, and she got ready for it the way Walter Kessler had done all things in his life, without hurry and without witness, building the thing quietly until it was strong enough to hold weight. The forced sale petition had come the way those things always come. In a stiff envelope, a man in a windbreaker handed her at the door of the exchange without once meeting her eyes. And it was full of the heavy, cold language that is built to make a person feel small and late and already beaten before she has read to the bottom of the page, respondent, motion to void the conveyance, real property of speculative and indeterminate value. Curtis Lang had signed it, and beside his name was the name of the man he had gone into business with, a developer out of the glass office towers on Jefferson Street, who had looked at a map of the rail yards and seen that the block where the old switching office stood was the last crooked tooth in a mouth he meant to fill with a parking deck and a long row of rail-side warehouses. The dead exchange had been a joke to Curtis when it cost him nothing to laugh at it. Now that the city was talking about the parcel, now that there was real money sleeping under that brick, the joke had a different sound in his mouth. And Curtis wanted his building back, except it had never once been his building. And that, Diane was learning slowly in the cold rooms of the exchange, was a thing made not out of feeling but out of paper. And paper could be carried into a courtroom and laid down flat on a table, where every man in the place was made to look at it. She did not have money for a lawyer. She had a little less than nothing and a building no one had wanted, and a box of her father's quiet secrets. But there is a small legal aid office down on Campbell Avenue, only a few doors up from the market where the farmers set their greens out in the cold, and a young attorney there, not long out of school and not yet tired of it, took one slow look at the recorded deed Diane spread across his desk and got very still. And then he said the thing that lawyers almost never let themselves say, which was that this was not going to be hard. For 3 weeks after that, Verna Sokol came down to the exchange every evening once the supper hour was past, and the two of them sat together under the lamp with the ledgers and the bonds and the deed laid out between them, and they built their case the way you build anything meant to stand, square and patient and true. Verna knew the hand. 30 years she had sat at the board beside the man who wrote it, watching him print out his trunk logs and his trouble tickets in that small, upright crook of letters. And she could tell his 3 from his 5 across a dark room. And she could tell, she said, the very seasons he had been weary, because in the hard months, his loops went flat and tired, and then stood up straight again when things eased. She would give it a voice. Diane would give it a silence. Neither of them ever said the plan in those plain words, but it was a better one than any silver-haired man could have sold them. The morning the hearing came, the cold had finally broken the way it does in Roanoke when the wind turns at last off the Blue Ridge, and the sky goes that thin scrubbed blue above the mountains. And Diane Kessler put on the one good blouse that had survived the suitcase and walked up the hill to the courthouse on Church Avenue with the oilcloth bundle held against her chest the way she had held it that first night at Verna's door, as if the thing inside it had a heartbeat. The courtroom was not large, and it was the same breed of room as the one that had stripped her bare a month before. The same flat municipal light, the same long varnished benches, and some of the very same faces in the gallery, because a small city stays a small city, and the people who had sat there and watched a woman fight for a junk building had come back to see how the joke turned out. Curtis sat up front in a suit she did not recognize, a finer suit than any he had owned in all the years he was married to her, and beside him sat the developer, smooth and unbothered, a leather folder open across one knee, and at their elbow a lawyer with silver hair who billed, the young man from legal aid had told her, more in a single hour than Diane had to her whole name. When the matter was called, the silver-haired lawyer rose and spoke for a long while in the warm, reasonable voice of a man who has never once been told no by a room like this one. He spoke of the settlement, of the $1 his client had so generously accepted to let the property pass, of changed circumstances and of equity, that lovely soft word, equity, by which he meant only that now the thing had value. His client deserved a slice of it after all. He asked the court to void the transfer, to fold the old exchange back into the marital estate, to order the place sold and the money split down the middle. He made it sound like simple arithmetic. He made it sound already finished and signed. And when he sat, he turned and gave Diane a small, kind smile across the aisle. The smile you give a child whose toy you mean to take away for its own good. Then the judge looked out over the top of his glasses and asked the respondent whether she wished to be heard. If you have been waiting through all of this for the moment the quiet woman finally stands up and says the thing that puts every one of them to shame, I have to tell you now that the moment never came. Diane Kessler made no speech. She had spent 30 years being talked over and talked past by Curtis Lang, and somewhere in those years, she had learned the one thing he never did, which is that the loudest thing in any room is a plain fact that no living person can answer. She stood, and she did not say one word. She walked to the clerk's table, and she set down 3 things upon it, one beside the next, in the flat light where every soul in that gallery had to look at them. She set down the deed, the notarized deed of gift, the city's recording stamp pressed deep into its corner, conveying the old exchange on Campbell Avenue to Diane Kessler as her sole and separate property, entered into the deed books of the city of Roanoke 11 years before that morning, years before any petition, years before any divorce, back when she was still a married woman who did not yet know her own father had already made certain that whatever else this world stripped from her, it would never be able to lay a hand on this. She set down the bonds, the thick gold brick of them, more than half a century of small monthly mercy, bought one at a time at a post office window, every single one stamped by the Treasury of the United States and carrying her own name written out in Walter Kessler's crooked patient hand. And she set down the ledger, open to the page where the names ran in their long, still column, the Hartleys and the Coyles and old Mrs. Pruitt over on Day Avenue, all of them people her father had carried on his own back through 40 hard winters so the line would never go dead in a house with a sick child in it and no money for the bill. Then she stepped back and she folded her hands in front of her and she let the paper do the talking. It was Verna Sokol who gave that paper a voice. The old woman was sworn, and she took her glasses out of her bag and set them on her nose, and she bent over the documents the way she had bent over a switchboard for 30 years of nights, and she began to read Walter Kessler's handwriting aloud into the silent room. She read his name where he had signed away the building. She read the dates off the face of the bonds, slow, one after another, this year and back, until the reading itself became the proof of it. Because there is no forger anywhere on this earth with the patience to fake 52 unbroken years of a man's tired loops going flat in the lean months and standing up straight again in the good ones. She read down the column of the families, and when the silver lawyer rose to object, the judge lifted one hand without even turning to look at him, and the man sat back down, because even he could hear by then the thing that had come into the room, which was a dead man telling the truth in his own hand, louder than any living voice in the whole building. The judge did not need long after that. He sent the clerk down to the deed books, and the clerk came back and confirmed in the dry, flat voice of the record what the stamp on the corner had already sworn, that the instrument had been entered in the city of Roanoke 11 years prior, outright to Diane Kessler alone. And once that was laid on the table, there was nothing left standing of the silver lawyer's beautiful arithmetic, because you cannot fold a thing back into a marriage that was never once inside the marriage to begin with. And you cannot void a gift a father gave his daughter long before the man bringing the petition had any claim on her at all. The property had never been marital. It had never been part of any estate. The single dollar Curtis took at the settlement had bought him exactly the nothing he had been so very proud to hand her. Diane watched it land on him. She watched her ex-husband come slowly to understand, the way he came slowly to understand most things, that the one piece of the whole pile he had been dead certain was worthless trash was the single piece that had been hers, and only hers, the entire time, deeded and recorded and waiting under a coat of gray paint while he stood in a courtroom counting out the silverware. The developer closed his leather folder without a sound. He did not look at Curtis. He rose, and he buttoned his coat, and he walked out of the courtroom before the judge had even finished speaking, the way money always leaves a man the very moment he stops being useful to it. And Curtis Lang sat alone at the front of that room in a suit he could not pay for, with a claim that had just turned to cold ash in his open hands. And he did not turn around to look at the woman in the gallery because he could not. The order came down that same afternoon. The Roanoke City Circuit Court dismissed the petition to void the conveyance and confirm the deed, and entered into the standing record an order that the old exchange on Campbell Avenue could not be sold, partitioned, or raised out from beneath the woman who owned it, and the clerk carried that order down into the very same deed books where Walter Kessler's gift had slept for 11 quiet years, and stamped it, and shelved it, so that it stood now in the open record of the city for anyone who ever cared to go down and look. The railside plan for the block died on a surveyor's table inside the week. The warehouses went up somewhere else, on somebody else's ground. And the bonds, when Diane carried them at last into the bank on Jefferson Street, redeemed for real and documented money, 52 years of it with the interest grown up thick around the principal, like ivy on a wall, more, by a long and quiet mile, than the house Curtis had fought so hard and so loud to keep. That night she went back down to the exchange, and Verna came with her, and they did not switch on the hard, buzzing work lamps. Verna crossed instead to a gray steel cabinet against the back wall that Diane had always taken for nothing but an electrical panel, and she opened it, and she stood a moment with her hand resting on a row of old knife switches worn smooth by 30 years of her own fingers. And then, one at a time, she began to bring the board back to life. It came up slow. Somewhere down under the floor, a transformer the city had never gotten around to cutting hummed and took the load. And all along the great dark face of position, 4 and 3 and 2, and on down the whole silent row, the little call lamps began to glow, one and then a scattering and then a long, full field of them, soft and amber and warm as candle flame, the exact gold that Diane had watched move across her father's face the few times he had brought her to work as a girl and let her sit up on the high stool and listen to the whole city talk to itself in the dark. The board had not lit in 40 years. It lit now. And in that low amber light, the long room rose up out of its grave all around her, the cords and the keys, the headset hung on its hook, the little shelf where a man had once taped his daughter's school picture so he could look at it without a single soul catching him at it. And Diane Kessler stood there in the middle of all of it, in the one place left in the world with her own name on the door. She had carried that tan suitcase onto a bus out of her old life, and up a cracked walk in the cold, and into every hard room since, holding it out in front of her like the last plank off a wrecked ship. She did not need to hold it in front of her now. She crouched down behind the supervisor's desk where her father had sat all those years, and she pushed the empty suitcase back into the dark underneath it, out of sight and out of the way. Above the door, the dead neon stayed cold and unlit. Behind the glass, the old switchboard burned amber into the night.